Hey guys and girls, welcome to this week's episode of the B.Invested Birchy podcast. I'm your host Nathan Birch, and this is the show unraveling the truth to the facade of the 21st century. We're now exiting the matrix and waking up to motherfucking reality. Today, we're going to be talking about how to help your children get into their own property. So there's always, every time I go on to news.com or one of the news sites, there's always these stories of people getting help or they're doing something different. And, there's lots of articles out there in the world and a lot of people with different strategies, different things to talk about. And, I guess, a lot of people are finding it difficult to go and buy a property today because it's getting harder. Prices are rising, inflation is hitting everything out there, and people have to get themselves in a lot more debt than what they ever have done. If you look at numbers out there, people say, oh, it's much tougher today. I heard all these things, 20 years ago when I bought my first property. I'm sure they were, 20 years before that as well. Every generation has issues that it has to face, and this is just a new issue to overcome. People will be paying a lot more for their properties, and they will continue to do so in the future as inflation hits even harder. I think a lot of one of the times when I speak to my investors coming on board, or just investors I've been working with for a few years, they always tell me, oh, I'm scared of how my kids are going to be when they get older, or I'm scared that they're going to not be able to afford anything. I want to buy a house for them for when they get older and all these sorts of things. So, it is a topic that a lot of people think of. It's a topic that a lot of people have issues with, and it's a very relevant topic in 2025. And to be frank, I don't see it changing anytime soon, right? It's going to get worse and worse for younger people and people starting out to get ahead in property investing. So let's say that you're starting out. This video is more tailored towards parents wanting to help their children, but also you could just be wanting to get your first property and thinking, shit, I can't get ahead of. I want to buy a house. It's $1 million to get a unit in my area, whatever. How do I get started? If I look back through numbers, I've been doing this 22 years now buying properties, and I was talking to one of my investors probably about a half an hour ago, just before I started this podcast and came into the podcast studio. And this investor has got a few properties. I bought them like 10 years ago for this client. And I was like, shit, you need to get another 20 properties in your portfolio, right? Like, you've got a few, it's gone great, but we need to push it harder. And he's like, yeah, that's what I want to talk to you about, because, I'm happy with what I've done, but I want to get to retirement. So I looked at this guy's portfolio. He's got a couple of properties that I bought in the Gold Coast, for example, bought them for like 250 grand. Now they're 700 grand, 750 grand, whatnot in the Gold Coast. So I think to myself, wow, right? If someone wants to buy a 2-bedroom unit in the Gold Coast, 10 years ago, you could have bought there for 200. A lot of people didn't. A lot of people did. But then we look at it now and it's like, how do you get started, right? It's 700 grand. It's still relatively cheap to get that property, but in another 5 years, 10 years time, that'll be $1.5 million. How would someone start? And naturally, interest rates keep getting pushed lower and lower, and the barrier of entry is getting easier and easier to get in there from a cash flow perspective. However, the big difficult part is getting the deposit to get into that property, because if you need a 20% deposit on a 750k property, now you need 150, 200 grand to get into that property, where 5 years ago, I could pick up for 200, 250, which would be, 50, 70 grand to get into that same property. So the barrier of entry is getting tougher and tougher. And I guess that comes to the purpose of like, well, what options do we have around that? If you're a parent, how can you help your children? What sort of ways are there? And what can you do to plan for that? And what is the best way of helping out? So I'll break it down like, firstly, a lot of people think, oh, I'm just going to help the kids out. I'll go guarantor from them, right? The structure of how you can help your kids out can be very low risk to very high risk. 9 out of 10 times I've seen people that have done guarantor, like I'd do the guarantor or the parents helping the kid out maybe 1% of the time, right? Most of the time, young people are coming to be invested and they're doing it themselves. But the times that I do see where the parents are helping them out, I'm like, and I have to give them like stern talkings to, because I'm seeing that there's great risk for the child and for the parent that's helping them out because they don't structure it right, and everyone's at a dire risk. So I'm going to jump into that a little bit later on the podcast. But the important thing is looking at it from an investment perspective and not necessarily an emotional perspective. Oh, I've got to buy the house to live in or whatever, right? If you're maybe 40 or 50 or whatever, 30, 40, 50, and you've got a property that you live in or you own a property, I'll just ask you to go back to when you bought your first property. And when you bought that first property, was that the property you thought, I'm going to buy my first home and live here forever and raise a family and die in this house? Or is this a home that you got in because it's the best you could afford, and then you're going to upgrade to another house later on? And quite often people buy a property, they'll live there for 5, 10 years, they'll go and sell it, they'll upgrade to another property, they'll live there for 10 years, they'll raise their kids, whatever, then they'll move into retirement, not in a retirement home, but like a house that they could retire to on the beach or whatever. So at different stages of your life, you need a different caliber of property. So a lot of people, I think today, think, well, I need to have a house like my parents had, right? I need to have a house on a 1/4 acre block. I need to have a house with, 4 bedrooms and all that sort of stuff. But reality is that different seasons you go through, different things that you require in your life, and what do you need at that point? So if you're not buying your dream home from day one, and let me just say, I didn't buy my dream home from day one. I bought the shittest properties that I could afford because I thought the homes that were half decent, which I could live in, were unaffordable at the time that I was buying, right? I was buying stuff in Sydney for 450 grand back in 2003. I was buying little shitters for like 150K, but I could have bought a house for 450 grand, but it would have been so severely negative cash flow, like 40 grand a year, because the interest rates were so high and all that sort of stuff. I would have been stuck and trapped in that mortgage, and I wouldn't have been able to get in my dream house. It's like I live in today. When I say dream house, I've got a few that I live in between. And it's important that you look at it holistically. You have a plan for where you want to be in the future. If you're just starting out today and you know that the first house that you're not going to be living in is going to be the home you're going to live in forever, well, you need to realize, hey, this is an investment that I'm making, and it's not a home that I should be adding in my emotional attachment to. So you got 2 options. One is you can buy the house to live in straight up, and that will limit you. You might have to move to a unit. You might have to move to a different location. You might have to move to a different state. You're going to be very, very severely disadvantaged by doing that. Second option is that you could just go, okay, I'll just buy a property that will get me by for today, which is more humbling. And in the future, we'll look at upgrading that. But once again, is that going to be the best financial sense? And when I see people go, oh, I'm going to buy a unit in this location, I'm like, well, if you bought that property as an investment property, it would be negative geared and it wouldn't be the best investment. So I'd rather rent that and then go and buy the house in the area where it makes better financial sense with good growth potential, good equity potential, and whatnot. So when working through, okay, I'm going to buy my first property, is it best to buy the house to live in? 9 times out of 10, I'd say it's not. Or is it better financial sense to go and buy some investments that are much more palatable, much more less risk? You've got tenants out there paying you positive cash flow for them, and you can afford to rent where you want to live and invest where you can afford. So what I mean by that is, let's say you live in, I don't know, Western Sydney, right? You can buy a fibro house for $1.2 million, right? I say that with a smile because people used to say I was crazy buying them for like 150K. You still buy those properties where they were 10 years ago, but they're not in Western Sydney. They're in different states and different locations and different capital cities. But buying a fibro house in Western Sydney, I don't think it's a goal for everyone to end up in that position. If you were to rent that house, you might rent it for $400 a week or $500 a week, but it'll be heavily negative geared. For that same $1.2 million, you can go and buy 5 or 6 properties at 250 grand a piece, which bring you in $400 a week each. So if you're buying 5 or 6 properties renting for $400 a week, $400 a week times 52 is 20 grand a year, let's call it. Times it by 6, there's 120 grand worth of income coming in for your $1.2 million worth of purchases that you do, instead of getting a house that you're not even really happy with. The benefit of that is that you got 5 or 6, you've got less risk, you've got more hooks in the ocean out there to catch equity and growth, and sell off properties to buy the one you want to live in the future. So a few options there. So if you break it down, if you need to buy $1 million house to live in or property to live in, the $1 million might be, you'll be close to mum and dad, you'll be doing this, that, the next thing. But is that the right decision that you could be making, right? Like, you're going to be tying yourself into a bigger mortgage. You're going to be tying yourself into a fixed cost for the next 30 years. It's going to put pressure on you. It's going to put pressure on your family and whatnot. Or, for $1 million, you need to put down a couple $100,000 for closing cost, deposit, stamp duty, all that, and a big debt. Or you could buy a 250 grand property, which you only need 50 grand for, and you can get in there much more palatable. You could sell your car and go buy it. There's lots of different options, right? But those properties that you buy for 250K, that property could double quite easily, right? Let's just say that 250 grand property goes to 350 grand or 450 grand. Now you've got one or two of those properties. You've now got equity of 100 grand here, 100 grand there. You can pull that equity instead of going to mum and dad and pulling out of their equity. You can pull out of your own equity. You've put 50 grand down. You buy a 250 grand property. It goes to 350K. You've got 100 grand worth of equity you can tap into. Let's say 80% of that's 80 grand. You get that $80,000 back and you can use that as deposit for the next property. Or if you've got 2 or 3 of these properties, you can go, okay, there's 50 grand here, 50 grand there, 50 grand in the next property. I can use that for the deposit for my dream house, right? You've got more options, you've got more choices, you've got much less risk. So for anyone starting out, I'd really consider, is making that move to your first house to live in, or is it the first house that's an investment property? Getting on to parents and how they can help, there's lots of ways that you can help. You can give them a deposit. Most parents think, I'll go guarantor for my child. I'll give them a good step up. That's good. How do you structure that? Is the first thing. So let's say you've got a house you bought in 1997 for 200 grand and now it's worth $1 million and you owe 200 grand on it still, right? Your property's worth $1 million. You can get up to 800 grand worth of loan on it. You've got a 200 grand loan already, and you can pull out an extra $600,000 worth of equity. Cool. A lot of people, let's say the parent's 60 years old, they've got a kid that's 20 or 30 years old, and they go, I'll go guarantor for them, right? There's a massive, massive risk when people do that. And the reason why that risk sits and exists there is because you're not thinking about what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years' time. You're not thinking about other parameters that attach to the deal. So you say, yep, I'm going to use the property. The bank takes your property and cross-securitizes it with your child, and they can get into their property. But the bank's now using, let's say that your child needs 100 grand worth of equity out of your property. They're now taking your property, so you can't sell it. If you want to sell it, it's going to make it difficult. If you want to retire and move to your retirement house and sell your house, you're now strapped to your child's house. And the bank, if something happens to your child, then you're liable for that debt, right? So you are now personally liable for that debt. Secondly, or thirdly, is that you've got 600 grand worth of equity. They're just using 100 grand of that equity. You've still got another 500 grand worth of equity in that property you could use and be much more, able to move. But the bank's still got a charge. They've got like a very low LVR over your child because they're taking you and strapping you on the debt. So I see that as a big risk, and 99% of people do not even think about that at all. If it was me and I was a parent in that scenario, and I had a $1 million house with a 200 grand loan, my kid needs 100 grand, I would go back to the bank and I'd sit down with my child and say, hey, you need 100 grand. I'm going to pull 100 grand out of my property. So go to the bank, refinance your house from 200 grand to 300 grand, pull that $100,000 out and say, child, here's $100,000. I can then do whatever I want with my property. I'm not financially responsible to the child's property or anything like that. The child then has an obligation to you to repay you that and to service the debt. So I'd say, hey, I've got a 100 grand debt over here. I've pulled that out for you. It's going to cost me 6% interest. That's $6,000 a year. Pay the $6,000 and there's my gift to you. You can service it and get on your own 2 feet. You've provided the ability for your child to get into a property. So I would rather that being clear cut rather than going, oh, I'll just strap my property. I'll do what the mortgage broker tells me to do or whatever. That could be setting you up as a parent very, very badly, your child up very, very badly. Like if they want to go and sell the property, let's say 10 years passes, you're in retirement, you've gone from 60 to 70, you're wanting to sell, move, whatever. Something happens to the child and they want to get away from it, the bank will need to assess both of your positions. If there's not enough equity in the property at the time, then you could be very much in trouble. If you want to go and sell the property, well then your child's property is at jeopardy, not at jeopardy, but your ability to sell your property is at a much riskier position. So it's not good being trapped. So structure it is very, very important. If you're a parent and I don't know, you're 40 today or whatever, and you've got, I don't know, 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old or whatever, and you're thinking, how can I plan for my child for when they get older? Because I'm scared of the big wide world out there because, inflation, I can see how bad it is to live today. What's it going to be like in another 10 or 15 years or 5 years? What options do you have? Well, that would be a position now that would be thinking, okay, I've got $1 million house. I'm just using this as an example. I've got $1 million house, and let's say I've got $500,000 worth of debt on it. I bought it for 600, owe 500, and now it's worth $1 million. I can go to the bank and get a loan at 80%, so 800 grand worth of loan, minus the current 500 grand loan. I've got 300 grand worth of equity. How can I utilize that 300 grand worth of equity to get me retirement myself, as well as getting my children looked after? So that'd be a point where you go, okay, 300 grand worth of equity, I pull that out. There's 5 or 6 deposits on a 250 grand property. I can go buy 5 properties with that. I've got 2 kids, Bob and Sally, just making up their names. Bob and Sally. If I had 2 kids that I wouldn't call them Bob and Sally, no offense to any Bobs or any Sallys, but let's call them that. Bob and Sally, I want to look after them. I'll buy them. I've got the ability with my 300 grand. I'll buy 5 properties. I'll buy one that I intend to give to Bob when he turns 20, and one that I give to Sally when she turns 20 as well. Those properties are 200 grand a piece now. In 5 years' time, they could be worth 350 grand, right? Instantly when they turn 18 or 19 or 20 or whenever, I can then sell it to them for whatever price and say, well, don't worry about paying me that deposit. So they go to the bank and it's worth, I bought it for 200, it's worth 400. I can get a loan at 80% of that, which would be $320,000. So the time I can transfer those properties to my kids, they go take out a debt. Yeah, they've got a 320 grand loan. They've got 120 grand in their pocket. I've got all my capital back, and I'm happy to see that they've now got 2 deposits there that they can go and buy their own houses. Plus they've got an investment property, right? Plus I've already got the 3 properties that I bought back in 2025 or whenever the year was. And I can use those properties to pull equity and buy another 3 or 4 properties and another 3 or 4 properties. So I can still build a portfolio of 5, 10, 15, 20 properties in my portfolio, whilst my kids, I've harbored and taken care of assets for them whilst they're unable to. So yeah, you're giving them the equity. Yeah, you could go, well, I bought it, get stuffed, right? But you're planting the seed now for when they get older, they're instantly being given a property that's got equity in it that they can use that for their first deposit, right? So if the kid needs $100,000 for the deposit, you bought it for 200 now, in 5 years' time, it's got 120 grand worth of equity in it. You're getting all your capital back. You're getting all your money back. And they're getting the asset and they're getting equity. They've got their first investment property, plus they've got the deposit to buy their first property. You've set them up miles ahead than anyone else would be in their grade at school today, right? So it's important to, fast forward and think about that. When I was 18 years old, I was thinking, okay, how am I, going to build for my kids? I always thought to myself, how could I have children if I can't look after myself? So a lot of people go out there and have kids when they're young and stuff like that. And it makes it tougher because they haven't set themselves up financially and whatnot. So I always thought, I'm playing for my kids, I'm playing for my grandkids. And nowadays I think to myself, one day I'm going to be a grandfather and then my grandchildren will be sitting there. And reality of it is like, how far do you have to help down your food chain? Like when I'm long gone dead, people will be sitting back going, oh yeah, I had this guy who was like a great grandfather, right? But real serious question, this is interesting, right? Do you know your grandparents, all 4 of your grandparents' names? First name, middle name. Do you know what they were? They're your grandparents, right? And then if you do you know your 8 great-grandparents' names, right? It's a very short time period passes and you may or may not know your great-grandparents' names. So I think about it today, I'm like, fuck, I've been planning this since I was 18 years old, right? It's pretty crazy. So there's lots of things that you can be doing, and a lot of people feel that they're trapped or they feel that their kids are trapped. And it can feel that way if you don't have the knowledge because you're not thinking about other ways, right? Everyone's just like thinking, okay, I've got to go to work, got to go to school, got to get good grades, get a job, get a property, get myself into a debt, have a roof over my head, whatnot, right? But it's 2025, and anything could be anything you want it to be in the world. And I think it's important to look at things holistically. I think it's important to look at the world and think, okay, like the thing I don't get at all, still to this day, and I've been yelling about this for the last 7 years on YouTube videos, podcasts, and whatnot, is the inflation, the death of our currency. And I'm not going to go into this too much today, right? But there's still people there thinking me paying off my debt is the best thing I could be doing. Debt is bad, right? Let me tell you, debt 10 years ago of $500,000 was scary, right? Debt of $500,000 today is up, it's nothing, right? Debt, when I first started buying my first property of $200,000, I literally had nightmares about going bankrupt because I had a $200,000 debt, right? Having debt for 150 grand on an investment property, how many properties didn't I buy myself personally, Nathan Birch, didn't buy because I was scared of, there's another 100 grand worth of debt. Even I had those fears back in the day, not that badly, but just there were things that I'd question. And I just walk out into a car park, walk out on the street, hop into traffic, and I will see that there's multiple cars, every car I drive past, whether it's a Tesla, I don't even know how much Tesla worth, right? They could be cheap shit boxes, I don't know, right? 50 grand, 80 grand, 100 grand, right? People are driving around. One thing I do know is utes, right? An old Land Cruiser, 70 series, right? 100 grand there. Ford Ranger, Raptor, 115 grand. There you go, right? People are driving around with a car loan, right? Normal cars I own, like heaps of them be rented or loans or whatever on them. But the thing is that like, it was only 20 years ago, I was sitting there thinking I'm going to go bankrupt because I've got a 100 grand loan on a property that brings me in $300 a week. So when you realize that the debt is nothing, the money is nothing, they're just printing. You go to work and earn some money and, you save it in your bank account for the next year and, you've got 100 grand saved up. That 100 grand from a year beforehand won't buy as much stuff as it did the year before. So yeah, buying assets, working hard, paying out the debt is not the smartest way. It's actually the dumbest thing you could do is be working hard to pay out the debt. So, and I guess it's always important if you're going to be helping out your children or getting help from your parents, sort of assessing market risks that are out there, like what are the risks that are in the market, what the geopolitical things are happening, what's happening with interest rates and all that. They're all things to be mindful of. As I said before, and I think it's important to understand your situation and either your child or your parent's situation, whoever's watching this, thinking about, what's the growth going to look like on my property? Because if you're borrowing the money off your parents or you're lending the money to your child and you're wanting to get it paid back, what's the ability for them to be able to do that or cut the umbilical cord if you're cross-collateralizing the properties? What's the wage going to be like and the servicing of that debt? I see people that want to help their kids out by getting a property that lives around the corner from them, but I feel like when you see them on the auctions and stuff like that, I feel that 9 times out of 10, people are setting their kids up for failure because they're strapping them into this debt. They want their kid close to them. They want to live in the same street or the same neighborhood. And it's like, that's a big debt you're strapping your child at such a young age, right? So just be very, very careful of, mindful of that. And I guess when buying, your first property, there's things to consider, like, am I going to buy that principal place? Is it better for me to rent vest? They're questions that you need to get out an Excel spreadsheet, get out some sheets of paper, draw down $1.5 million for this. What could I rent it for? What was it worth? What's it going to cost me every week? What's the interest rate? What's the council rates? What's the bills that are attached to that? What would an investment property cost if I bought 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 of these things? How would that same $1.5 million look spent as an investor buying investment properties? And then work out, is it best to do, rent vesting or be an owner-occupier? Buying any properties, the 3 things I always talk about: buying at below market value, most crucial, right? If you're buying a house, like every time I've bought a principal place of residence, I've always thought, am I buying this thing below market value? So a little funny story. When I was, I don't know, it was maybe like 27 or so, 28. I bought my first, 27 maybe, 28. I bought my first house to live in. And it's like 13, 14 years ago. And I paid $1.2 million for it. And I thought to myself, shit, how am I going to pay for this thing, right? I bought it because it was where I wanted to live, where I wanted to live and all that sort of stuff. So I bought it. I got a 6-month settlement. I was like, shit, how am I going to pay for the deposit? I sold my first property I ever bought, which I regret. I just sold it on the day because I was like, fuck, I'm going to sell it so I can show everyone that I'm not emotionally attached to any of my properties. Right? I didn't care. Sell the first one, whatever. The numbers have to stack up. And I doubled the money and a bit more than doubled. It wasn't the best investment in the world, but it was still great. Like the thing would have doubled again since the time I sold it. But that enabled me to get like a few $100,000 in my bank account to pay for the 20% deposit on the property. So my first little shitter in Mount Druitt paid for me to live on my first 5-acre property that I lived on. I still own it. It's worth about maybe 5-6 million. So what I lost over there, I made up well and truly over on this side. But when I bought it on a 6-month settlement, I thought about it after a few weeks and I thought, shit, what happens if one day I can't afford to pay for this and I had to rent it out, right? And then I thought to myself, well, you know, that's $1,600 a week. It was about 9% interest rate, 8% interest rate on a 960 grand loan. So I went and put up about 30 of my rents, $20-$30 a week. So it's like $600, $700, $800 a week extra income. So I'm like, cool, that covers half of it. And if I had to rent the property out for $600 to $700 a week at the time, it would cover itself. So I thought, okay, well, there's sleep at night factor, which is very important. So my tenants that were in Mount Druitt and those little cheapies that I had paid for me to live in my 5-acre place that I, wanted to live on. Then I bought a second one a few years later. Maybe 6 years later, I bought a second house to live in. And then maybe like 3-4 years ago, I bought the house I live in now as a dream house. And that place I bought current is $4 million I paid. And when I bought that, I thought to myself, shit, I've just bought like 30 motels. I've crippled myself. I literally went out there and bought all those motels in Corona when they're on sale at pennies and a dollar. How am I going to afford this? And I went and I just sold. I sold a property I bought. It was a bulk deal. It was a unit that I bought. I paid 330 odd grand for it, and I sold it. I only owed 200 on that at the time in 2022, and I sold it for 1.2 million. So I had $1 million. There's $1 million towards my 4 million. And then I went and sold like another 5 or 6 properties in the Gold Coast that I bought for like 150, 200, for like 550, 600. And, I'd never stepped foot in any of these investment properties, but I realized it was time that I trade those chips. And that's all I had at that point because it was very tough, right? I pushed myself too much and I'd bought 30 motels, which is, it was fun at the time, but it was painful to settle them all and pay for them all. And, it was a pretty wild time. But the thing is that if I had to go and save up for $4 million property, I'd have to come to the table with like $1 million cash. Could I save that up? Yeah, I could, but would a normal person be able to save that up? No, right? If I wanted to pay it off and I was paying off at 50 grand a year, it'd take me 80 years without paying interest, without eating food, without anything to pay for that $4 million property. So to get that is very difficult. But because I had the investments, I thought to myself when I bought it, I was like, I need to enjoy my life a bit. I want this house. So the properties that I bought 10 years ago, the decision that I made 10 years ago to buy, and I thought about it, it was like really clear to me at the time when I sold one of the units I bought in a bulk deal, because I remember at the time I bought like 20 of them. There was like 100 units in a block, bought 20 of them for clients. I probably sent it to like 40 or 50 people. 20 people said, yeah. I bought 2 in there. A couple, all my clients bought all the rest. But when I bought there, people were saying, I don't like blocks of units. It's new. It's, it's a high rise. There's too many units in the complex. Whatever bullshit story was in their head. But it was that decision that when it came forward 10 years and I go, hey, most people have 1 or 2 options. They've got their income, they've got their spouse's income, you've got 2 incomes, you can go do something, right? I'm sitting there going, I've got hundreds of options, I've got thousands of options really, but I'm like, how do I best structure this? And at the day I was like, well, that's what I need to do. That's what I needed to do. But lots of people had that same option and they had the same choices, but they didn't take those choices. They didn't take those options and they didn't do it. And they don't live in that house. Some people live in better houses. Some people live in different things, right? So just be conscious of the decisions that you're making today in 2025 or whenever you're watching this podcast or listening to it have big repercussions in the future. Getting on to just a couple other things, right? Like you could go halves with a sibling, you could go halves with a spouse. I don't recommend those things, right? If you've got a spouse, like a boyfriend, girlfriend, it's 20, 25, whoever you're with, right? That's cool, right? But that can cause troubles as well, right? So say, for instance, you got two people that are younger and the dude's, they're planning to have a family. The wife's going to stay at home, look after the kids. The dude's going to work. Make sure that, is it best to put under both names? Is it best to put under the wife's name? Is it best to put it under the guy's name, right? Which way? Everyone's family dynamic is different. Everyone has different risks, income risks, job risks, financial risks, all that. Something to think about. But if, let's say you've got two brothers and let's say one's 26 and one's 28, you got to think what's going to happen when I'm 36 and I'm 38, right? And, one of the siblings wants to go and travel and party the world. And the other one wants to go and settle down and, play with the kids, right? So out of those two options, if you own a house together or a property, what happens 10 years on down the track, the debt that's attached to that property could affect your servicing, right? One of the two siblings want to sell off a property and the other one wants to keep it. So that puts a divide between them, right? So be very conscious of that. If you're going into a deal with someone, what's the pros and cons of it, right? Let's say that we've got two siblings, 26, 28 years old, and they can both borrow 500,000. Let's say they're on 100 grand a year and they can borrow 500 grand, right? They both got 50 grand deposit to go into a property or 100 grand deposit to go on a property each. They could pull that together and they'll go, cool, we'll go buy the property. But the bank, nearly 95% of the times, the banks will look at you as jointly and severally liable for that debt. So they'll take 100% of one sibling and 100% of the other sibling's income to support that debt and go, yep, we'll lend to you. So technically, maximum price of 500 grand for the two siblings to go in halves, or you could have one sibling buying a 500 grand property, the other sibling buying another 500 grand property, and you're having $1 million worth of asset jointly between you under two separate names. So very important to think of, when you're buying and the structuring of that deal, structuring of the debt, and how's it going to look out in the future. And I guess, what is the term of what you're trying to achieve from that property? So if you're buying a property, what's the goal for it? What's it going to achieve for you? Is it a buy and hold long-term strategy? Is it something you're going to buy and flip? I've seen heaps of people flipping properties over the years, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. However, I've seen people come to me and say, I'm happy I bought a property for 200 or sold it for 400. But 5 years later, they'll come back saying, I shouldn't have sold that. Now it's worth $800,000. I wish I bought more. I wish I didn't sell it, all those sorts of things. So work out your strategy that's best for you. For me, it's buy and hold. I want to just buy assets, accumulate wealth, and hold them in perpetuity. So, I think it's important to have clarity around all parameters. With buying a property as a first home, right? Just something very important. This is where I think there's a mistake that people make quite often, is that they look around and, there's lots of good things like first homeowner grants and, benefits and stuff like that, right? Going back 20 years ago, there was like a $7,000 first homeowner grant, which was pretty cool. It was given to everybody, right? But as time has gone on, there's been a shift more towards pushing people to buy a brand new property. Because if you're building a new property, you're adding supply into the market and you're also employing, tradies and plumbers and keeping the economy going by doing that. So there's a lot of incentives about buying a new property. For me as an investor, and just any way of looking at it, when you're buying a new property, you're paying an overpriced price for it. So I want to buy the property below market value. So buying a property below market value and brand new does not really come hand in hand with each other. So there's other factors to think about, right? So how much are you getting from the first home buyer grant or from the grant that you're getting? As sometimes I've seen people get $50,000 and it's like, well, hang on a second. If I've got no deposit or I've only got like 10 grand or 20 grand and they're going to give me 50K, well, maybe it can work out, right? But if you're sitting at home living with your parents and you've got 50 grand deposit and you can buy a property for 200 grand, that's cool, right? And that's a very great financial sense. But if you have to push yourself to buy a brand new property for $800,000 and you're going to get yourself into this debt that you can't afford, and then you're going to have to sit there for 6 months, live in it, and then move back to mum and dad's anyway, right? You're missing out on 6 months worth of rent, which would have been that cost anyway. So I see a lot of people that will try and panel beat the purchase that they buy to fit around a grant. And the grant is not necessarily the best thing that you could be taking off the table. So I'm not saying that a grant is bad. I'm just saying to think about it, because people are wanting, I want to take this money, I want to get this 30 grand or 20 grand. Generally, it could be like 10 or 15 or 20 grand, maybe saving you some stamp duty and stuff like that. In a lot of instances, I'd say 90% or 80% of the time, it's probably best to have a good solid foundation plan on buying established properties rather than pushing yourself into something new, overpriced, not worth it, because you're going to make it up on one way or another, and you're going to pay for it one way or another as well. So for government grants, I don't talk about them all that often. That's why I even forgot to insert this into the podcast in the first take of the podcast, is because they're not something that becomes a part of my vocabulary, because they 80-90% of the time it's in a negative way. If you're renting and you've got a family and you're living in a new housing estate area, and buying a house, a land package might be 600 grand and the house is worth 550 anyway, well, maybe it's okay, right? But quite a lot of the time when I'm seeing these new properties get built, they're being sold way more than what they're worth. So just be food for thought, and be mindful of taking that grant. What is the risk and what is the benefit of that? And let me just say, at B.Invested, at least 50% of my investors that I work with are first-time buyers, right? They could be 20, they could be 40, they could be 50, they could be 18, right? The amount of times that someone would use a first-time and a grant would be less than 1%, right? Even 1% of the people that are buying those assets. And there's times when I do buy properties that are new or would cover through those sort of things. Just be very cautious of it. So if you're buying a property and it's a free stamp duty and it's not a brand new property, cool. If you're going to live into the property anyway, cool, it can work for you. But if you're trying to buy a property just to make it work so you can get access to those grants, and it's not the right thing and you're not going to live in it and you don't like that property, I'd be really concerned about buying a property just to get a grant, right? Because it's going to screw you up. If it falls a part of, hey, that's the benefit of it, happy days, just be very, very cautious of that. So if you need help on, setting out that strategy, reach out to the team. You can contact us at 1300 367 925 or email us at admin@binvested.com.au. At B.Invested, just for some of our long-term listeners, people don't even realize, right, what we actually do and how we can help, investors. I talk about all this stuff and it's like, well, what do I do now, right? So my office, I was one of the first buyer's agents in the country, started the business 16 years ago, 2009. There was no such thing as a buyer's agent back then. Now everyone's a buyer's agent, right? So we're the OGs of buyer's agency. I have a finance company where I can help people, structure their finance correctly. I have a team of brokers that, specialize in all different types of finance for sophisticated investors. So, most brokers can only help you at a very basic elementary level. We've seen it all. We've experienced it all. We've been a part of over 20,000 real estate transactions over the last 16 years. So, we've seen all the different things in between. So if you need help with financing your goals, if you need help with finding the properties, if you need just guidance and put in the right direction, I have property managers throughout the country, accountants, lawyers, planning, structuring, all that sort of stuff. If you need help, you can reach out to us, and that's what we specialize in helping people do. So on that note, I'm going to leave it there. Not going to waffle on anymore. But thanks a lot for tuning in. Make sure if you like this, share it. Tag one of your children. Tag your parents in here. Share it around. I appreciate that. All the support we can get is great. And you can subscribe on Google Play, Apple Play, Spotify, and YouTube. I'll see you next Thursday. Have a great week. Bye for now.
Like Bilal said, man, we're stuck in the matrix. This my advice. Don't care if you take it.